This is an episode of Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, which was first released in May 2024. You can listen to the full series as well as our other projects, Beast, the murder of Nora Sheehan, and Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler, wherever you get your podcasts.
And did you know who Marlo Hyland was?
I never heard of him. Never heard nothing. He was all I had. I did have a second child, but it was a stillbirth.
Right.
And there was 9 years in the difference. And every year I'd ring Anthony on the baby's anniversary. And I'd say, do you know what it is? He'd say, I know, it's Leslie's anniversary. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. We had that closeness.
The 80s had the General, the 90s had John Gilligan, and in the noughties it was the reign of Martin Marlo Hyland. He ruled over the drug scene, working his way up the ranks, taking the opportunity to step in when others fell by the wayside. He grew increasingly reckless and paranoid and therefore became a liability. He had to go. And the circumstances of his death just added to his legacy. That an innocent young man doing an honest day's work lost his life is just terrible. You're listening to Caught in the Crossfire, Episode 1, Every Dog Has Its Day. Just before 10 a.m. on the 29th of February 2024, a white van pulled out of the gates of Portlaoise Prison, and as the driver cruised past the waiting bank of photographers, he flicked up his middle finger. Not the politest of salutes, maybe, but perhaps his annoyance at being snapped was understandable. In the back of that van, crouching down out of sight, was a man who was once at the heart of Gangland, Ireland. John Mangan might not be a name many people will instantly recognise. After all, he's been behind bars for the guts of 16 years. His one-time boss, however, the man he served as a loyal and trusted lieutenant, was one of Ireland's most feared, and for a time, most prolific mobsters. Martin Marlo Hyland was the head of a crime network that stretched its tentacles right across Dublin City, and who Mangan is suspected of helping to murder on the 12th of December 2006. At a time when gangland slaying was at an all-time high, Marlo Hyland's death at the hands of former henchmen as he lay sleeping in the spare room of his niece's house might not have been all that shocking. In fact, it was inevitable, and most likely the shooting would simply have been added to the long list of hoodlums who've died as a direct result of their involvement in Ireland's drug wars. But there was one horrific twist. A sweet-faced apprentice plumber, Anthony Campbell, also happened to be in the house that morning. An innocent young man doing an honest day's work, completely oblivious as to the identity of the dangerous criminal sleeping upstairs at the house in Finglas, North Dublin, where he'd been called out to that morning. This football-crazy 20-year-old with sandy-coloured hair and a strong Cockney accent had nothing to do with crime. In fact, his mother, Christine, had moved him back from London, where she'd raised him on her own, to her home city of Dublin when he was 17 years old because she feared him going down the wrong path. Knife crime, especially amongst teenage boys in the English capital, was escalating at a frightening rate. And while Anthony was a good boy, all it took was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a risk she wasn't willing to take, and so she brought him home. But Dublin had changed since Christine had moved across the Irish Sea when Anthony was just a toddler. In the mid-noughties, drug gangs were more ruthless than ever. It was the height of the Celtic Tiger, and business was booming. Heroin was still popular, but the demand for cocaine across the country from every corner of society was through the roof. There was literally tons of money to be made. And there was nothing that wannabe crime lords weren't prepared to do to claw their way to the top and to the riches they believed were waiting there. But in the struggle for control of any kind of vast wealth, there are often those who get trampled on and left behind. In the crime world, this often means something a lot more sinister: murders and maiming, and in the worst cases, innocents getting caught in the crossfire. Of course, Anthony Campbell wasn't the first blameless victim of Ireland's gang wars, and neither will he be the last. But there was something about the killing of this young man that's remained with me for almost 2 decades. The fear he must have felt that morning as 2 men crept into the house where he was working, one of them sneaking up the stairs to a bedroom where Marlo Hyland lay sleeping. And then hearing the gun blasts and the sound of the hitman thundering back down the stairs. Anthony didn't stand a chance. A young man much loved by his family and adored by his friends for his cheeky sense of humour. His great passions were Everton football and expensive shoes. He had no dealings with people like Marlo Hyland or his ilk. Since he was a youngster, his mum, Christine, had made it clear to him, if you wanted nice things in life, you got a job, you worked hard, and then you'd be duly rewarded. Marlo Hyland, on the other hand, had been a criminal since he was a kid. It was the usual trajectory: petty thieving, dangerous joyriding, running with a bad crowd. There was tragedy in his life, of that there's no doubt. But ultimately it was power that turned Marlo's head, and in the end it was his own prodigious cocaine habit that led him down a dark, paranoid path, making him a liability that had to be dealt with. By mid-December 2006, Marlo trusted very few people. Where once he was head of the biggest crime network in the country, he now only had close family who were happy to help him. He was top of the Garda's most wanted list, and as a result of a crackdown, huge amounts of drugs were seized and lots of his foot soldiers were arrested. Where once Marlo had a loyal army to do his bidding, he had no idea who was still on his side. It's amazing how quickly things can change in the criminal underworld. You can go from being the number one guy at the top of the pile to being the guy at the bottom. And in many ways, I think that with Marlo Hyland, it was because of his success and obviously then the interest of the Gardaí in him that was his own downfall.
Yeah, Marlo Hyland actually had, in a way, become involved in the drugs business later on in his career to an extent. He'd really made his reputation as an armed robber. And the drugs trade, he got into it just in the very early 2000s. He became a full-time drug dealer, I suppose. And at that point, there was a boom going on in the drugs business in Ireland. And there was gaps in the market caused by the downfall of the Gilligan gang. At the time, cocaine had started to become available across the streets of Dublin, but you also had the rise of the drugs trade across the country. It became a nationwide business, and Marlo Hyland became one of the first major wholesalers, not just to provide drugs for the market in Dublin, but he had a network of dealers that he was supplying across the country. Marlo Hyland's gang, and it was estimated, I think at the time, to have something like 30 people that were really key members of it. They had a quick rise to the top, and in 2005, the Guards instituted Operation Anvil, and that was really to look at gun crime in general in Ireland. And as that operation took place, they came to realise that Marlo Hyland really was at the centre of a lot of it.
I think ultimately, despite all the murders he was involved with, it's the murder of Anthony Campbell that he's possibly most associated with. And ironically, he had nothing to do with it. No, he had nothing to do with it. Anthony Campbell is another one of those murders, like the murder of Biba Salute, and like a number of other murders over the years, like the murder of Shane Gagan or Roy Collins in Limerick, where it really digs into people's consciousness. It really makes people wake up and see what's going on. And of course, Marlo Hyland didn't facilitate any of that. But the people that carried out that murder learned how to act, if you want, under Marlo's direction. Anthony Campbell and Marlo Hyland were both killed by people that were trained to every level by Marlo Hyland himself. It is quite ironic. For retired Detective Inspector Brian Sherry, who served on the front line for 36 years and was involved in some of Ireland's biggest profile gangland cases, Anthony Campbell's murder proved to be something of a turning point in his own career. He's described it as the final straw. For an officer who worked in Blanchardstown and Finglas when gangland warfare was at an all-time high and who saw countless dead bodies of young men, seeing that, it almost broke me, he said.
When I walked into the house that morning, I saw him on the floor with a hole in his head. And he was lying just under the radiator. That's how the plumber couldn't see him. And he was like a child of 15. He was 20, but he didn't look it. Like, I mean, I have seen some horrendous scenes and I've been in horrendous situations and things like that, and it never affected me. This one did. Young Anthony was just left on the ground. Like, I mean, and as I said to you, he was a young man. He was 20 years of age, but he certainly didn't look 20. Like, when I saw him, he looked like a young lad of 15, just lying curled on the ground. And you could see where the bullet had gone through his hand, like where he obviously put his hand up to try and protect himself or shield himself from what was coming. You know, so it was a tough scene.
There was something about his face, the innocence, the smiling child about to become a man.
Yeah.
You know, and the idea that it was a mother's only child and she lost her only child in such...
Oh, it was the cruel...
senseless.
It was really cruel. And she was a lovely woman.
Was there a huge amount of pressure? I mean, the publicity around the case was so huge, the innocent victim.
Well, I know, like, I mean, obviously, like, I mean, we had a lot of pressure from my authorities, like, I mean, at the time. But, you know, like, I mean, and rightly so, probably, like, I mean, because everyone wanted to solve this case. And, like, I mean, we had regular meetings with the Assistant Commissioner, who was Martin Callanan at the time, Noel White, who was the Detective Chief Superintendent in the NBCI. We had certain, you know, we had people from the NBCI giving us assistance for a short period of time, but then they were, like everything else, they were dragged away for other crimes. You know, like, I mean, so we were back down to our own resources, like, I mean, which were limited, and I mean limited, like, you know, but on top of that, you say, like, I mean, you know, like, I mean, I could have 3 or 4 murders going on at the one time, you know, like, I mean, it was horrendous.
Horrendous.
And it was one that we all wanted to solve, every one of us. And we put our backs and bones into it. The amount of work that went into it was just incredible. Like, I mean, we didn't leave any stone, and I'm happy we didn't leave any stone unturned. Like, I mean, and when I left, it was one, how would you say, one murder of, you've murders that I had, like, I mean, that we didn't solve, obviously, like, I mean, but none of them, like, I mean, affected me like this one.
There were so many sliding doors moments when it came to events on the morning of 12th of December 2006. Anthony Campbell wasn't supposed to be in that house in Scribblestown Park in Finglas for a start. He and the plumber he was working for were booked in to fix the heating system the night before, but they'd worked late on another job and were too tired, so they'd arranged to do it the next day instead. And they could have had no idea that Ireland's most notorious crime lord at that time was sleeping upstairs in the spare room. The house belonged to Marlo's niece, Karen Hyland, who lived there with her partner, Jason Mackin, and their 2 young daughters. After falling out with his girlfriend, Marlo had asked if he could stay with Karen's family, and he'd been there for the previous 3 months. It was an arrangement Jason Mackin later admitted to feeling anxious about. After all, it was well known that Marlo's life was in danger at this point. He was a marked man and he slept with a samurai sword next to his bed. Anthony Campbell knew nothing about any of it. He was just pleased to have picked up a job again. A few weeks earlier, he'd been made redundant from another plumbing firm he'd been working with. But he'd managed to get the new position as an apprentice just in time to earn some money for Christmas. It's a time of year that was always special for Anthony and his mum, Christine.
And then, do you know when it used to hit me worse? Christmas. When you'd see people out shopping with their kids. Because every Christmas Eve, me and Anthony met and went shopping. And that was their little thing. And he'd get me a present, I'd get him a present. And I hate Christmas.
Perhaps the most shocking element of Anthony's death is that not a whole lot has really changed since then. The cast of characters has gone through several shake-ups. Once familiar and feared names have, like Marlo Hyland, disappeared in hails of bullets, only to be quickly replaced by other thugs, more than happy to step into a predecessor's shoes. But with John Mangan's release comes the stark reminder that, despite the Garda's best effort, no one was ever charged with murdering Marlo Hyland. Neither the two men who stormed that house or the other man who sat waiting for them in a car outside, none have ever faced justice. And while there might not be much sympathy or interest in the killers of Marlo Hyland facing a jury for their crimes, the murder of Anthony Campbell is still officially unsolved. It's a fact his mother, Christine, has had to grapple with for the guts of 2 decades. Not only losing her only child in the most horrendous of circumstances and the struggles to adjust to a new life without him, but no one spending even one night behind bars for her son's murder, something she sometimes blames herself for.
I would say the first 2 years is the toughest because it's one thing dealing with your child dying, but having to open your heart up to the public. And then you can't say this, you feel you're being silenced all the time, if that makes sense.
So do you mean the extra pressure that you sort of had to get out there, fight for justice for him?
Totally, yeah. And then they'd say, you can't say this and you can't say that. And I was like, well, what's the point of doing it? I know you can't just be.
Yeah.
But I was like, yeah, there was all that. So it was a whole new ball game that I wasn't used to.
But you did a really good job with all that. And you came across really, really well.
I tried my best.
Well, you did.
But you always doubt yourself because there's always something that you're saying, what more could I have done? And as a mum, I can be hard on myself because I don't feel I got the justice I should have for him. I'm let down by that.
And when did that kick in, that sense? Because that can't surely kick in immediately when you're still in that deep shock.
Tell you when it kicked in, as the years start going on. And I thought, man, you'd get how I experienced it was, you get your hopes up and then your hopes is crushed. And as the years start going on, yeah, it does something to you because you cannot say you haven't changed in all the grief, but yeah, you're still looking, you feel like you haven't done them proud because you didn't get the justice. That live with me because it is what it is.
And so it's like a year goes by, a second year goes by, a third year goes by, and you know that whoever has done this, has taken him from you and has taken his life, is still free.
Yeah. Or even in prison, I knew that.
Yeah. But they're not, he was never serving.
No, the time for Anthony. And that was the bit it took me a long time to get my head around that. Like, surely. But see, I found other things out over the years as well. So certain things make sense now. Because, as I said, I've only found this out recently. He should have been done for another murder, but they say he was a grass. Because how did he get away with what he got away with? But we see, when you're not from that world, I find you don't understand it. You see what's put in the papers, but it's still, because you don't live in that world. I find that hard to, get that around my head. Because how he got away, like when they caught him first with the gun, out in Sandramount or wherever he was. He was after getting grey hair overnight. Now, at this stage, I'd never seen the photograph, but everything pointed to him, if you know what I mean, because he got more sentence. So that was the clue.
And when did you start openly talking to the investigations officers about Johnny Mangan as an individual?
Straight away.
Straight away. So they were talking to you, you were talking to them. The dogs in the street knew this.
Yeah. They were shocked that I was able to give the two names within the first week. It wasn't even a week, it was a few days.
Christine's right. When you're not from that world, it can be very difficult to understand how it works. And ultimately, there are no rules, and there's no such thing as honour amongst thieves. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and if it looks like your day is over, the end is always brutal. No one knew that better than Marlo Hyland. It's how he got his own start. It stands to reason it's how he'd finished up. Those who met him during his reign, like my old friend Joey the Lips O'Callaghan, knew immediately they were in the presence of a very dangerous and volatile man. Joey, who was the youngest ever person in Ireland to be signed up to the Witness Protection Programme, had been groomed by a violent drug dealer, Brian Kenny, since he was 12 years old. By the time he was 14, already deeply immersed in the terrifying world of selling drugs, he was brought by Kenny to a pub where Marlo Hyland had agreed to listen to Kenny's pitch for a position within his vast criminal network.
I'll never forget the first time meeting Marlo Hyland. His presence. Everyone was afraid of him. Everyone wanted to be around him. Brian Kenny, who I was living with and working for, brought me to meet him that day. I was 14 years old, and to be honest, I wasn't totally sure I was going to come back after meeting him. It was one of the most scariest moments in my life.
Caught in the Crossfire is produced by Crime World. Writer and producer Jane Finnegan. Producer Clodagh Meany. Audio editor Jason Malini. Art and graphics Enda Bulger. Executive producers Nicola Tallant and Ian Malini.